Alright, so I think it's pretty safe to say that Superbreak as a damage archetype has kind of fallen by the wayside over the past year or so. Honestly, it's been kind of reminiscent of how Dot was before it recently got Hysolins, and with a new Break character coming soon, I feel now is a pretty good time to do a bit of a retrospective on what happened to Superbreak. To start, those of you that have been watching me for a long time might remember my older video where I called Superbreak a mistake. While at the time I certainly didn't expect the game to go the way it has, looking back on it, I wasn't entirely wrong. See, back in that video, what I basically talked about was the idea that Superbreak as a concept is flawed. In short, it was flawed because Superbreak was extremely easy to build your characters for, even easier to play, and to top it off, did very competitive damage with the best non-Superbreak damage dealers at the time. Something I compared it to was a reaction-based damage from Genshin Impact, where you basically only had to focus on one or two stats for the reaction to function, or in this case, you only have to focus on Break for Superbreak to be impactful, and as a result, I felt it took a lot of nuance out of the game and what there is to do in it. So today, I wanted to discuss what's happened with the archetype and why it's turned out the way it has. But first, a word from today's sponsor. Topping up in gacha games can get pretty expensive, and if you happen to be looking for a way to bring those prices down, then LootBar.gg is definitely worth checking out. LootBar is a trusted top-up site where you can make in-game purchases for multiple titles with up to a 25% discount, and it delivers your order within seconds after payment. For example, if you're someone who wants to marry Cyrene, they've got a character guarantee bundle that you can purchase just to get her. All you've got to do is enter your UID and select your server for instant delivery, and I'm sure your new anime wife will thank you for that purchase. If you just want to top up in general, you can also check out their other popular bundles, like the limited 6,480 crystal pack or the all-in-one bundle, both of which have really nice discounts too. LootBar is super easy to use, safe, and secure. It supports multiple payment methods, has 24/7 live customer support, and is trusted by tons of creators and players around the world with a 4.9 out of 5 rating on Trustpilot. So if you're interested in getting the best bang for your buck rolling for your next anime girlfriend, you can click my link down in the description below or in the pinned comment to get started. New users will get a 10% discount code, and even if you're a returning user, you'll still get an 8% discount code automatically. Thanks again to LootBar for sponsoring this video, and now let's get back to it. One thing I didn't really talk about in that video though is something more unique to Superbreak as a whole, and also in my opinion part of the reason that Hoyo decided to push it out of the meta so quickly after 2.x. And that's the role having some unique abilities that other damage archetypes just don't have in the same capacity. Sure, Superbreak characters are really easy to use, but in my opinion the bigger part is the different reasons of why they're so easy to use. And that's because of the innate mechanics that all the main Superbreak DPS carries have, which is the ability to either implant or ignore the weaknesses of enemies. Personally, I view implants as something like a privileged ability that not everyone has, right? Like, while they do actually need to break the enemy to deal damage, at least currently anyway, being able to implant weakness enables the different units to be played in almost any scenario as long as their damage can keep up. I mean, I still remember when Kafka was an apocalyptic shadow boss with 2 side minions that you had to defeat in order to actually break Kafka, because she had 0 innate weakness in that fight. But the 3 main break DPS being Rappa, Boothill, and of course Firefly could actually completely ignore the way the fight was intended to be played by simply implanting a weakness onto Kafka who previously had none. And like, let's be real here, that is crazy. People that chose to bring Superbreak units to that fight had a fundamentally different experience to someone that brought a regular DPS that was meta at the time, like Fei Zhao for example. And that's not the only place you are able to do that, to be clear. For example, you could do it against Cocolia as well instead of killing the different pillars that she summoned, and since she's still in Apocalyptic Shadow now, that is still something you can do with Superbreak units. And all that is what I mean by it being a privilege. When you're able to just do something entirely different from everyone else while also being competitive with them, then that gives you an inherent advantage compared to those other units. If you combine that with the fact that pretty much all of the Superbreak DPS pretty much only need to build one stat, you've got a pretty big compounding problem for the game's balance. It's actually pretty similar to the characters that have innate crit values in their kit. Like, let's be real here, is there a reason that Evernight needs a free 35 crit rate for just activating her first major trace? Not really, because she is more than strong enough even without that ability. Yet all the same, she's got something like that whereas the other crit DPS don't, again inherently giving her an advantage over those other DPS. I will say on paper though, it is not necessarily the worst thing in the world to have a damage archetype like this. It definitely made the game more accessible for the time it was the main part of the meta, but I do think it was also just way too strong for how easy it was to both use and access. As a result of this, my main concern was that the game would scale up in one way or another so that the power of Superbreak would feel toned down overall, and yeah, I think it's pretty safe to say it's definitely been scaled up since then. Obviously, we've had the usual, dare I say it, HP inflation. FBI, open up! But there's also been something else that's scaled up and been inflated a lot too, and I think it's caused quite a few problems not just for Superbreak, but also the game as a whole. And what I'm talking about is the toughness bar of enemies. See, Superbreak has kinda had a double whammy in terms of getting pushed out of the meta, and that's because while it is very easy to use, the fact that the damage it can do overall scales off of two different things lends itself to being bottlenecked in two different ways. Like, for an average crit DPS, the only thing that really matters for them is whether or not they can do enough damage with their crits to kill the enemy. But for a break character, they not only have to worry about dealing enough damage, but also about whether or not they can actually break the enemy to begin with so that damage can be dealt. It's basically a compounding problem for them that's pretty much unseen elsewhere in the game for other damage archetypes. I guess the closest thing would be the dot archetype when you play it against really fast enemies, but honestly, I still feel like Superbreak actually comes out worse overall. I will say there was always the risk that an enemy may be released that has the locked toughness bar that can't be broken at all, for example more enemies like the Sand Boss, but the bar itself increasing in strength wasn't something that anyone really accounted for back then. That said, all the same it did end up happening. For example, if you look at the Warrior of Valor, who is an elite monster from Amphorius, their toughness bar is actually stronger than Cocolia's bar is. And let's be real here, that is insane. And that's not even counting for the fact that if elites have that high of a toughness bar, then the actual boss monsters we fight are on an entirely different level. So when I'm talking about the double whammy that break characters got hit by, I mean that the toughness bars have really become a brick wall that's hard to break through nowadays. Unfortunately though, like I mentioned earlier, the toughness bar increasing doesn't just affect break characters. Really, the benefits of an enemy being in a weakness broken state are just too impactful for pretty much every team in the game except for Yunli and I guess Clara too. So the fact that the toughness of enemies has pretty consistently risen over the course of 3.x hasn't really done the non-break characters any favors either. I mean, think about it, a character like Fei Zhao literally has a part of her kit that lets her deal more damage to weakness broken enemies, and a character like Finon is relatively consistently ran in sustainless teams, so getting hit isn't exactly at the top of his team's priority list. We've even got characters like Anaxa who can implant every single weakness in the game just so that his teams can break and get to the higher damage state even quicker, and on top of that, his ult can even keep them in that state even longer. Like, in the current day and age, there's not really any teams that don't prefer the enemy to be broken, and as a result, by punishing Superbreak, everything else also gets punished. And sure, that's not to say that newer characters like Anaxa or Finon are having any particular problems clearing content even though that the toughness has risen, but keep in mind, they're newer units. Like, try taking Argenti, for example, into the same physical weak stage that you would normally take Finon into and see how that goes. I'll be here when you get back. All of this is kind of the downside of making such an accessible archetype of damage. When something does an equivalent amount to the best thing while being easier to access, then what incentive is there to use anything other than that? Not a whole lot, right? So, while I don't necessarily blame Hoyo for increasing toughness as a band-aid solution to the problem, I do think it's a bit of a shame that it hurts more than just the archetypes they were trying to nerf. And I also think it goes without saying that there's a difference between nerfing and killing an archetype. Really, if you're someone that hasn't invested beyond E0 into your Superbreak teams, be honest, when was the last time you actually used them to clear endgame content? I mean, maybe the most recent Night 1 in Anomaly Arbitration, but that specific stage was the first time we've actually seen those enemies built for the break meta since all the way back in the 2.x era with Fugue. And I think that's a whole other topic that's worth talking about. While the actual damage that Superbreak has done has been affected by both the HP and toughness of enemies increasing, there actually was one more problem that I don't see people talk about all that much. While during 2.x I think it's pretty safe to say that Superbreak was heavily shilled, I think something that's happened in 3.x is almost like a reverse shilling of Superbreak. And what I mean by that is that almost every Superbreak unit in the game has been pretty much directly countered in some way during 3.x. Like, at the start of 3.x, prior to us really moving into the HP meta, we were definitely in a more AoE focused meta where characters like the Herder really shined. Theoretically, being an Erudition character, Rappa should have done really well there too. Yet due to the toughness of enemies rising like I mentioned earlier with the Warrior of Valor enemy, she didn't end up doing as well as expected. For Firefly's case, she really enjoyed having the HMC in her teams and just going sustainless, but due to the RMC's existence, she basically just lost a teammate. And for Boothill, due to the meta being more AoE focused, he's had a pretty rough time dealing with the larger amount of enemies than we saw back in 2.x. It's honestly been pretty interesting to watch happen over the course of Amphorius because at least back in 2.x, the complaints about Shilling were so heavily focused on the break meta that now that we're in 3.x, it's almost like the opposite is happening now. And the other thing is, that's not even mentioning that during 3.x, we've had basically 0 enemies that have weakness that favors the break characters. I mean, I guess after Finon's release, Boothill got a bit of a saving grace, but he is still struggling a bit regardless. Like, when I go into endgame nowadays, it really feels like a surprise when I'm like, oh hey, I can actually run my break characters here. I used to love running Superbreak Himiko and seeing all the follow-ups she could get and whatnot, but without there being any fire weak enemies and Fugue not really doing enough to enable her unless you get E1, that kind of team composition just isn't viable pretty much at all anymore. And that's one of the unfortunate downsides to this kind of reverse shilling, or in other words, what I mean is that it takes away a lot of the opportunities that you can play your different characters in. As someone that always advocates for diversity in gameplay, it really does kind of suck that some of our older favorites just aren't really all that usable anymore. Though, speaking of shilling, again, as we get the character upcoming in 3.8, I kind of expect the reverse shilling to go back in the opposite direction again, at least for a little bit. Lastly, one more thing that I feel is worth talking about is something that I feel has been an issue for a very long time now, not necessarily just with Break, but it definitely affects Break quite heavily. And that's the fact that honestly, some archetypes of damage just simply get left by the wayside, and that doesn't exactly help them stay meta relevant. Like, apart from the character coming soon, the last Break-focused character was literally a year ago with Fugue, and let's be real here, Fugue wasn't exactly an amazing character unless you invested vertically into her for E1 or E2. Really, Superbreak as well as the other archetypes like Dot and even follow-up Team suffer from a lack of characters being released that actually help develop their gameplay. I mean, think of how much more variety a Break team would have if one of the units that was playable in it was like a Sunday type character, but they buff break effect rather than crit damage and speed rather than crit rate. And that's just one example. There are so many different opportunities for characters to fit into the different damage archetypes the game has, but the way that Hoyo decides to release characters generally focuses on the most recent one, and as a result, like I mentioned earlier, causes all the previous archetypes to be left by the wayside and not really get developed. I feel like the obvious solution here is just releasing more characters, and particularly 4 stars would be nice for that, but I feel like the way that Hoyo releases its characters doesn't really lend itself to that being feasible anymore. Again, it is worth mentioning here that as always, the last 4-star character that was released was Moze back in 2.5, and I really do feel like it's such a shame that characters that they've shown off since then have kind of just been left in NPC jail when they are more than fitting to just be released as a 4-star character to help players out. Like, what if Mr. Rekka, for example, was released sometime during the early or middle parts of 3.x as a 4-star break-focused character that also had a memo sprite? He would technically fit into the current meta with remembrance characters and definitely would have opened up the opportunity for Break to be more relevant again without having to wait all the way until we go back to Penacony in the upcoming 3.8 patch. Another example is Lancer from the Fate Collab event. They literally had an entire model made for him, and if I'm not mistaken, I think Lancer was the archetype that they used for Dot, so why couldn't he have been a character released for that? Apart from releasing characters, I personally think that an even better solution would be bringing back buffs and just doing them more often. Now that Break is out of the meta, I think now is actually the literal perfect time for those buffs to happen, and even further, they could use it as an opportunity to give all the Break characters more nuance in their kit. Like, instead of building Firefly with break effect, speed, and attack, what if one of her added buffs gave her increased speed depending on how high an entirely new stat like effect hit rate was, for example? In my opinion, I feel like something like that would give builds more variance. Like, do you go all in on damage by just building break effect, or do you change up your build and go for something super speedy instead by double dipping into building 2 different stats? That's just one example, but there's a lot of different ways that they could go about doing this for each individual character, and I really do feel like if Hoyo wanted to, they could move Superbreak away from how simplistic it is to a more defined and unique damage archetype. But unfortunately, it seems like they'd rather just remove even more nuance from the Superbreak archetype by allowing Superbreak characters to deal damage even easier, and well, if you know, you know. To me, it's a bit disappointing that that's the route they decided to go with the archetype, because I really do feel like there's potential for it to be more than just a basic free damage kind of thing, and at the end of the day, it really just depends on if Hoyo wants to invest the time into making it viable again long term. I feel like this end of patch release just to quote-unquote fix an archetype really won't have any lasting impact, because unless they continue to release more characters to develop it further as we go into 4.x, I just see it falling off again just like it did with Fugue, and in all honesty, I don't really feel like the 3.8 character does enough to bring it back to begin with. But here's to hoping though. Like I mentioned earlier in the video, I don't really think that the issues that Superbreak has is entirely unique to them. I mean, again, prior to Dot getting Heistlands, that archetype was pretty much dead in the dirt too, and I can definitely see it falling off again, just like how I expect Superbreak to. Hoyo, please, I am begging you, please don't neglect your old damage types just to shill Elation in 4.x. But anyway, that's all my thoughts, and I appreciate you listening if you made it this far. If you have some thoughts of your own on this topic, I'd love to hear about it, so feel free to leave a comment down below or join my Discord link down in the description to talk with me about it. As usual, thank you so much for watching, subscribe, and if you haven't already, maybe give my other videos a shot too.